Kendra Holloway had been labeled slow her entire life, ignored in classrooms, sidelined by teachers, written off before she ever spoke. But on one ordinary morning, in front of a room full of doubters, she solved an impossible problem in under 3 seconds. The classroom froze, phones came out, and by sunset her name was everywhere. But as the video went viral, a school board email leaked, one that said, "No student like her should ever test that high." What happens when silence breaks the system wide open? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the heart of Brookridge, a small suburban town in Indiana, where the autumn leaves curled along the edges of perfect sidewalks, a quiet storm brewed inside room 207 of Willow Ridge Elementary. The classroom hummed with fluorescent lights and the ever-present chatter of fifth graders laughing, comparing sneakers, whispering answers, and raising their hands before questions were even asked. Among them sat a girl who rarely moved, rarely spoke, and never drew attention. Kendra Holloway. She occupied the second-to-last seat by the window, her small fingers always curled around a pencil she never lifted, unless told. Her dark brown eyes drifted often, not in defiance but in curiosity toward the world outside, where things made more sense. Wind didn't judge, trees didn't interrupt, squirrels didn't call her names. To most of her teachers, Kendra was a mystery they didn't care to solve. The labels formed early, before Thanksgiving break: withdrawn, nonverbal, lacks focus. Mrs. Elaine Crawford, her homeroom teacher, had been the first to say it during a faculty meeting. "Some kids don't get it. You know, it's like there's a fog. Kendra's in that fog." But what no one noticed was how Kendra never missed a pattern. When the classroom clock lagged by 4 minutes one morning, she adjusted her attention span accordingly. When Miss Crawford's mood soured, usually around the same time her phone buzzed with a text she wasn't supposed to read, Kendra kept her head down and remained invisible. It was a skill, not a flaw. Silence was her armor. Her mother, Monique Holloway, worked night shifts at St. Mary's Medical Center and juggled more bills than sleep. Each morning she combed Kendra's curls and packed her lunch with 2 sandwiches, afraid her daughter might not speak up if the first one got stolen again. She knew her child was different, but not broken, not dumb, just different. And different, in a place like Brookridge, was a diagnosis waiting to happen. Mrs. Crawford wasn't malicious, just efficient. She had 23 students, and an upcoming evaluation. Students like Kendra slowed things down. When she asked questions, Kendra never raised her hand. When she handed out reading assignments, Kendra finished them, but said nothing during discussions. And when the class played math races on the smartboard, Kendra never stood up, not even once. "She's behind," Mrs. Crawford muttered one afternoon, circling Kendra's name on her clipboard with a red pen. "I'm not sure if she's just shy or something else." Something else. That phrase echoed across meetings, hallway conversations, and late-night emails between staff. No one wanted to say what they were all thinking, but the tone said it for them. A quiet black girl in a mostly white class probably needed help, special help, and so the rumors started. By mid-January, Mrs. Crawford had compiled a running log of Kendra's deficiencies: limited participation, slow response time, poor articulation, though no one actually asked her to speak, and inconsistent eye contact. It all pointed toward one conclusion: developmental delay. That Friday, while the students packed up their backpacks and slid into winter coats, Mrs. Crawford sat behind her desk and clicked open Kendra's digital file. She scrolled past attendance, immunization records, and reading scores low but not failing, until she reached the teacher comments section. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Possible signs of cognitive delay. Recommend evaluation for learning disability. She paused, then added, suspected auditory processing issues. Minimal verbal engagement. She clicked save without hesitation. As the classroom emptied, Kendra was still slowly zipping up her bag, eyes on the floor. Mrs. Crawford didn't offer a goodbye. She simply closed her laptop and stacked her folders for the upcoming parent-teacher conference day scheduled for the next morning. Kendra's mother would be there. All the parents would, and Mrs. Crawford planned to tell her, in careful, softened language, that her daughter might need to be moved into a more supportive learning environment. That night, Monique Holloway sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee gone cold. She was reviewing her daughter's recent math worksheet when she noticed something odd. Kendra had completed all the problems, but in a different method than the teacher had shown. She didn't carry numbers the right way. She grouped things visually, spatially, efficient, fast. Monique had never seen anything like it. Kendra, she asked softly, holding up the page, how'd you do this one? Kendra glanced at the page, blinked once, and said, it's the triangle trick. Monique blinked. What triangle trick? Kendra reached for a napkin and drew a small triangle. 3 parts, the number, its factors, and the difference. You just loop them. It always works if it's an even square. Monique stared. Where had she learned that? Before she could ask, Kendra had already left the table and retreated to her room. Quiet, soft-footed, vanishing like always. Monique didn't sleep that night. Something sat heavy in her chest, an unease that had no name. A mother's intuition tangled with the looming dread of a school system preparing to label her daughter forever. The next morning, the school parking lot filled quickly, parents in polished cars, gripping reusable coffee mugs, and performance reports. Kendra walked beside her mother in silence, head down, her small hand clutching the hem of her mother's coat. Inside room 207, Mrs. Crawford laid out her folders. One by one, parents sat down to discuss grades, behaviors, and growth charts. Smiles were exchanged, handshakes, encouraging nods. Then came Monique. Thanks for coming, Mrs. Holloway, Mrs. Crawford said as she gestured to the seat across the table. There are some things we should talk about Kendra. She opened the file. Monique leaned forward. But before the teacher could speak, a knock came at the door. It was Mr. Dalton, the new substitute teacher assigned to shadow several classrooms. He held a paper in his hand. His eyes scanned the room, and then fell on Kendra, who stood just behind her mother. Sorry to interrupt, he said, eyes narrowing. But I think we need to talk about this. He handed the paper to Mrs. Crawford. She glanced at it, confused, then frowned. It was a worksheet from earlier that week. The trick problem, the one not even her top students could solve. Kendra had solved it in 3 seconds, using a method no one had taught her, and she hadn't gotten it from the internet. He'd checked. Mrs. Crawford looked from the paper to the girl, then back to the paper. And then, without meaning to, she whispered to herself, how the hell did she do that? The teacher scrawled a developmentally delayed note in her file, just hours before discovering something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about Kendra Holloway. The walls of Willow Ridge Elementary whispered things long before they were spoken out loud. Kendra Holloway stood outside room 207, tracing her sneaker across the pale linoleum floor, her heart thumping like a quiet metronome. Just on the other side of the door, her mother sat across from Mrs. Crawford, listening to words that would shake the center of everything she believed about her child. Inside, Monique Holloway's breath hitched slightly as she leaned forward, trying to remain calm. I want to begin this by saying Kendra is a sweet girl, Mrs. Crawford said in the same rehearsed tone she used with all the more difficult cases. She's quiet, respectful, never causes disruptions. Monique's fingers tensed over her notepad. The use of sweet always made her wary. But, Mrs. Crawford continued, sliding a folder across the table, we've observed some things this year. Patterns, indicators that suggest Kendra might be struggling in ways that require a different kind of support. She turned the folder to face Monique, tapping one page lightly with her French-tipped fingernail. At the top in bold black letters were the words, learning disability, probable. Monique stared at it. Her mind tried to connect the phrase to her daughter, the child who reorganized the spice cabinet alphabetically, who memorized the bus schedule after a single glance, who could mimic any rhythm after hearing it once. But the word clung to the paper like a brand. Learning disability, she repeated, her voice cracking like dry glass. It's nothing to be ashamed of, Mrs. Crawford said quickly. Early intervention can be so helpful. With the right program, the right classroom. She doesn't have a disability, Monique interrupted. She's just quiet. Mrs. Crawford tilted her head, smiling politely, but with practiced detachment. Quiet, yes, but silence over time, especially when paired with certain social and academic markers, can sometimes signal deeper cognitive barriers. Outside, Kendra's fingers slipped from her backpack strap. Her breath caught in her chest. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the door was thin, and her name echoed louder than any hallway noise. Monique was still inside, scanning the notes. Words leapt off the page like accusations, nonverbal tendencies, slow task execution, difficulty engaging, possible auditory delay. Her vision blurred. She had always worried. Of course, worried that her daughter's silence would be misread. That in a school system built for loudness and speed, children like Kendra would be flattened into misfit labels. But seeing it in black and white, seeing it entered into her daughter's permanent record, made her stomach twist. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "She gets things at home. She's observant. She remembers things I forget. She taught herself how to count backwards in Spanish. She may be masking certain challenges," Mrs. Crawford offered, her voice overly patient. "We see that with a lot of students, especially girls. They compensate in different environments." Monique wanted to scream. Not because the woman across from her was wrong, necessarily, but because no one had asked Kendra what she needed. They just decided. "I'd like to see a specialist involved," Mrs. Crawford said. "We could arrange for a full evaluation. It's not a label, it's a tool for access." Access. That was the word they used now instead of removal. A soft knock came at the door, and in stepped Ms. Laurel, the school counselor, her ivory cardigan folded tightly around her thin frame, her smile just tight enough to feel rehearsed. "Hi, Monique. Sorry to interrupt," she said. "I thought I'd join for the next part, if that's all right." Monique forced a nod. Laurel slid into the chair beside Mrs. Crawford and opened her tablet. "We've reviewed the profile, and we agree. Based on what we've seen, Kendra might thrive more in a classroom with a modified curriculum, lower student-teacher ratios, sensory accommodations, and a specialized social-emotional plan." "A special ed classroom?" Monique asked, her voice dangerously low. Laurel hesitated, then nodded. "Essentially, yes." "She's not disabled," Monique repeated. "No one is saying that," Laurel said. "But we want to give her the best chance to succeed, and this might be the setting that unlocks her potential." Outside the door, Kendra stopped breathing. Inside, Monique's body went rigid. She remembered her own childhood in Baltimore, being pulled from regular classes, not because she couldn't keep up, but because she was too quiet, too brown, too invisible. She remembered sitting in a classroom surrounded by children with wildly different needs, coloring worksheets while other kids learned fractions down the hall. And now, the cycle repeated. Laurel continued gently. "There's also the behavioral aspect, her avoidance of eye contact, her reluctance to speak aloud. We don't want her to fall through the cracks." Monique folded her arms. "So instead you'll put her somewhere you never have to see her again?" Laurel's expression froze for a moment. "That's not what I know exactly what it is." Mrs. Crawford cleared her throat and pushed a printed document forward. "If you'd like to think it over, here's the form to start the evaluation process. Just a signature, and we'll begin assessments next week." Monique stared at the paper. Signing it felt like betrayal, but refusing it might mean her daughter continued to be misunderstood, mislabeled, or worse, discarded. "I'm going to need time," she said finally. Laurel nodded. "Of course." Kendra was gone when Monique opened the door. She had slipped away, down the hall, and into the far corridor, where the mural of Brookridge future leaders was painted in bright cartoon colors. She stood staring at it, at the wide-eyed white children holding graduation caps, not a single brown face among them. She didn't cry. She just stared. And in that silence, something inside her quietly hardened. Down the hallway, Monique stood frozen in place, the paper still in her hand, the words learning disability, probable burned into her palm like an invisible bruise. But what no one saw, what no one predicted, was what Kendra would do just 2 days later. Not a scream, not a tantrum, a demonstration, a single act, in a crowded classroom, that would make every label they had tried to assign her instantly irrelevant. As Laurel returned to her office, she whispered to Mrs. Crawford, "If she doesn't improve after winter break, we'll initiate the transfer." They didn't realize Kendra had heard every word. The teacher's lounge at Willow Ridge Elementary wasn't a place of rest. It was a confessional, a low-simmering hive where prejudices dressed as professionalism. The scent of burnt coffee and warmed-over casseroles masked the deeper stench, assumption. It was here, nestled behind microwaves and laminated bulletin boards, that reputations were made, or more often, quietly ruined. Ms. Whitmore, the reading specialist, stirred her chamomile tea while scrolling through her tablet. "Did you hear they're finally testing that Holloway girl? The one who never speaks?" Mrs. Crawford didn't look up from her lunchbox. "Kendra. Yes. We've flagged her for cognitive delays. She always looked vacant." Whitmore added, almost to herself, like nobody's home. A few seats over, Mr. Daniels, the PE coach, chuckled. If I had $1 for every spaced out kid in that building, I'd retire next week. But she's different, Whitmore continued, lowering her voice slightly. She doesn't even react. I passed her in the hallway once, smiled right at her, and nothing. No blink, no nod, like I didn't exist. I've had kids like that, added Miss Bergstrom, the music teacher. There's always something going on under the surface. Trauma, neglect, maybe even autism spectrum. Could be cultural too. Cultural. That word hung in the air, like the smell of scorched toast. Mrs. Crawford finally raised her head. Her mother's been polite, but intense, defensive. She doesn't want to accept that her daughter might need help. Whitmore scoffed. They never do. It was always they. A category too vague to be named aloud, but always understood. Across the room, Mr. Dalton had just arrived, his coat still wet from the morning rain, his eyes scanning for an empty chair. He hadn't spoken yet, and no one really noticed him. Substitute teachers were like background noise, heard only when something went wrong. But he was listening. Kendra's name came up again. Between you and me, Whitmore continued, I wouldn't be surprised if she ends up like that Robinson boy from 2 years ago. Remember? Special services full support plan, never improved. Daniels nodded. They start behind. They stay behind, no matter how much we throw at them. She's not disruptive though, Crawford said thoughtfully. Just checked out. Like she doesn't want to be here. Or doesn't belong here, someone muttered. Mr. Dalton's jaw tightened. It was the tone more than the words. The soft-spoken, clinical condescension that disguised racism as concern. Kendra had become shorthand for don't expect much. Not because of what she did, but because of what she didn't do. She didn't smile. She didn't ask for help. She didn't behave the way they wanted her to behave. She didn't conform, so they assumed brokenness. And in that small, stale room, they fed off each other's certainty. It was easier that way. No one asked why a child might choose silence. No one considered what it might mean to grow up being stared at like an exception, or ignored like a burden. They called it detachment. They never called it survival. Mr. Dalton set down his bag quietly, eyes fixed on the floor. He wasn't a crusader. He didn't interrupt. Not yet. He was still new, still gathering data. But he took mental notes. Every comment, every assumption. Later that day, as the bell rang in the halls filled with the frantic scuffle of backpacks and sneakers, Mr. Dalton walked the corridors not as a teacher but as a quiet observer. He found Kendra during reading period. She sat alone, flipping through a worn copy of A Wrinkle in Time. Her eyes scanning the page but her pencil untouched. Her desk was neat, her hands still, her lips unmoving. When he walked past, her gaze flicked up, briefly. Not fear, not indifference, just calibration, as though measuring whether he would see her, or overlook her like the others. He offered nothing, just a nod, and her eyes returned to the page.
It was enough.
He watched as other students raised their hands with 2 eager answers. Loudness mistaken for knowledge. Meanwhile, Kendra sat absorbing patterns, quiet as breath, unseen by those trained to reward noise. Later that week, in the copy room, Mr. Dalton asked Mrs. Crawford casually, has anyone tested her for giftedness? Mrs. Crawford blinked. Who? Kendra?
Yeah.
Mrs. Crawford almost laughed. She hasn't even passed basic benchmarks. Has anyone asked why? Mrs. Crawford's expression hardened. She doesn't try. There's a difference between quiet and disengaged. But Mr. Dalton knew better. Some minds didn't show their brilliance under pressure. Some only bloomed in shadow. He had seen it before. Years ago, in Detroit, there was a boy named Elijah. They called him oppositional, stubborn, inattentive. He'd been written off before his 10th birthday. But one afternoon, during indoor recess, Elijah solved a number theory puzzle, intended for 12th graders. Not by formula, by instinct, pattern recognition. It stunned everyone. Except Dalton. Because genius often lives in the margins, and Kendra's margins were wide, deliberate, and built from years of being misunderstood. So he waited. He watched her during independent math time. While the others used scratch paper, Kendra stared at the board in total stillness. Her eyes didn't move, but her fingers tapped once, then twice, then a pause, a rhythm. She wasn't zoning out. She was calculating. On Friday, during an unsupervised moment in the lounge, Mr. Dalton quietly removed one worksheet from the early finisher stack. It was a trick problem, a layered logic puzzle disguised as basic multiplication. Most students skipped it. Some attempted it, and failed. Dalton placed it on Kendra's desk the following Monday without saying a word. She looked at it. 3 seconds passed. Then she wrote the answer. Not just correct but explained. It didn't make sense. The pattern was too complex for her grade level. She hadn't just guessed. She had solved it. He took the paper, wrote nothing, and slipped it into his folder. Later in the teacher's lounge, the same voices filled the air. Another round of careless theories about Kendra's limitations. But Dalton didn't join in. He had already seen the truth forming. That afternoon, Mr. Dalton requested access to Kendra's student file. As he clicked through her digital record, his jaw dropped. A standardized score had been buried in the wrong tab, placing her in the 99.8th percentile for spatial reasoning. No one had ever mentioned it. Tuesday morning arrived with gray skies stretched low over Willow Ridge Elementary. Inside room 207, the fluorescent lights flickered faintly as students trickled in, dragging their feet through the sluggish start of another routine day. The air smelled faintly of pencil shavings and disinfectant. Desks scraped, chairs shifted, and the ambient noise settled into a low murmur of youthful restlessness. Mr. Dalton stood at the front, a substitute on paper, but something different in practice. He didn't fill time, he observed it, watched it move through students like light through glass. Most kids distorted it with noise and fidgeting, but one, just one, seemed to bend it to her own rhythm. Kendra Holloway. She sat as always, in the second to last row near the window. Her posture straight, her backpack already stowed. She had opened her notebook to a clean page before he even handed out the quiz. No words, no questions, just presence. Still and silent. Mr. Dalton handed out the pop quiz without fanfare. 5 logic problems, wrapped in simple math, designed to trip up anyone not reading carefully. They were low stakes on paper, but in his mind, they were diagnostic. A different kind of lens, one that bypassed rehearsed intelligence and measured raw cognition. As he moved through the rows, he watched the usual flurry unfold. Some kids raced through, others groaned, several tapped their pencils like Morse code. But Kendra, she didn't even flinch. He stole a glance. She had read the entire page in one scan. Her eyes moved only once, left to right. Then she began writing. Clean, small, tight answers. Line by line. No erasures, no hesitation. By the time the rest of the class reached problem 2, Kendra flipped her paper over. Finished. Less than 4 minutes had passed. Mr. Dalton blinked. He took her paper without a word and continued the room sweep. Back at his desk, he sat, pretending to read something on his laptop while sliding her quiz from the pile. His eyes scanned the answers. Every single one was right. Not just right, elegantly solved. She had skipped traditional steps and used comparative shortcuts, noting patterns and inversions. Her logic wasn't textbook. It was visual, spatial, gifted. He glanced toward her. Kendra sat with her hands folded, gazing out the window as if the quiz had never happened. A girl who'd been labeled slow just outperformed the top quarter of the class. In complete silence, he exhaled slowly. Something about this wasn't adding up. After lunch, while the kids were at art class, Mr. Dalton remained behind in room. He opened his staff laptop and logged into the school's academic portal. Teachers had access to limited student files, grades, behavior logs, basic notes, but substitutes didn't usually bother with them. Still, he wasn't just a substitute anymore. He typed in Holloway, Kendra. Her file popped up. Attendance. Perfect. Behavior. No incidents. Academic summary. Below grade level benchmarks in reading and math. Not meeting oral participation standards. Teacher notes. Rarely speaks. Suspected processing delays. Referred for further evaluation. Social engagement. Minimal peer interaction. Suggested action. Monitor. Recommend IEP screening. It was the kind of file that quietly followed a student through every grade. Not loud enough to trigger alarms, but heavy enough to close doors behind her without her even knowing. Then he noticed something odd. At the bottom of the screen, tucked beneath a collapsed tab labeled Assessment Data, Unverified, was a line item with a mismatched date. Fall Entry Evaluation, 2nd grade. He clicked it. A loading bar flickered. Then a table appeared. Test type, Spatial reasoning aptitude. Result, 99.8th percentile. Mr. Dalton sat still. The test was part of an old pilot gifted screening initiative. It had been administered years ago, before the district abandoned the program due to budget limitations. But Kendra's result had been recorded. Never reviewed. Never forwarded. Never used. A gifted score. Nearly perfect. Sitting unacknowledged in her file for 3 years. He clicked again to view the notes attached. Child nonverbal during assessment. Used visual pattern recognition to bypass verbal questions. Examiner noted high visual acuity and short-term retention. Flagged for gifted review. No review had occurred. No teacher had seen this. Not one. His heart pounded. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen. If this data had surfaced earlier, everything about Kendra's educational path might have shifted. Her grouping, her curriculum, her expectations. But instead it was buried, because someone didn't know where to look. Or worse, didn't want to. He printed the page, quietly, carefully, then folded it into a plain envelope. That evening, he walked the long way to the staff parking lot, mind racing. Teachers passed by him, chatting about weekend plans and lesson tweaks. No one mentioned Kendra. Not one. He opened his car door, sat down, and stared at the envelope in the passenger seat. It felt radioactive. Then in his rearview mirror, he saw something unexpected. Kendra and her mother walking home down the sidewalk, passing under the glow of the flickering street lamp. Kendra's head was low, her steps careful. Her mother spoke with small animated gestures, trying to draw something out of her. Dalton watched until they disappeared from view. The silence wasn't laziness or slowness. It was armor. That night, as he prepared for the next school day, he pulled up the next batch of classroom materials. There, buried in the system's suggested activity list, was a more advanced logic assessment, one designed to test creative problem solving, not memory. He copied the worksheet, then, carefully, altered one of the problems, turned it into a layered trick, a trap, not to embarrass, to confirm. The next morning, he handed it out like it was just another quiz. 3 minutes into the quiz, Kendra picked up her pencil, solved the trick problem, and slid her paper forward. Miss Dalton looked at it, and felt the air drain from his lungs. She hadn't just solved it, she had rewritten the problem to expose its flaw. The next day, room 207 felt different, like the air had thickened, even though nothing on the surface had changed. The desks were in their usual rows, the students filtered in at their usual pace, but something unspoken buzzed beneath the routine. Kendra Holloway sat in her usual seat by the window, expression calm, almost blank, but inside, her mind burned with silent energy. She hadn't told her mother about the logic puzzle from yesterday, the one Mr. Dalton handed out. She hadn't explained how the question's wording contradicted itself, how she had restructured the conditions before solving it. She didn't think anyone would believe her. They never had before. But Mr. Dalton had believed it. Or at least he hadn't dismissed it. He had stared at her solution for a long moment, then folded it slowly and placed it in his desk, not in the trash, not with the other graded papers. He had preserved it. That alone was a revolution. By mid-morning, the math block began. The usual practice sheets had already been passed out. But then, as students bent their heads to work, Mr. Dalton stood and quietly walked to the whiteboard. He uncapped a marker and drew a rectangle around the edges of the board. Inside it, he began to write. Problem of the day. What's the smallest number that, when divided by 3, 4, and 5, leaves a remainder of 1 in each case? Several students groaned. Looks like a trick, muttered Jonah, one of the louder boys in the class. Mr. Dalton didn't react. He simply turned, faced the room, and said calmly, "You don't have to solve it today. I just want to see who's curious enough to try." He walked back to his desk and sat down. Kendra didn't look at the board, not at first. She stared instead at her own hands. They were steady, but her mind was already turning, because she recognized the trap. The question looked like a riddle, but it wasn't. It was a misdirection. Most kids would try to solve it using brute force, trial and error. But Kendra saw the layers immediately. The problem required understanding of least common multiples and modular reasoning, concepts that weren't formally taught until 8th grade. It was a test of insight, not memorization, and it had been written specifically for someone like her. But here's the twist. The school had no room for someone like her. The Willow Ridge gifted program operated under a rigid matrix, 3 benchmark tests, 2 teacher recommendations, and 1 performance-based presentation. All must be initiated by faculty. Students could not self-nominate. The pathway required outspokenness, early bloomers, and verbal fluency. It favored the bold. It filtered out the quiet. And that was by design. Mr. Dalton knew this. He had worked in 3 districts before, and each had its own version of the gatekeeping mechanism. The test scores mattered, but only after the right adult decided a child was worth testing in the first place. And for black students, especially quiet ones, the bar wasn't just higher, it floated out of reach. He watched as students began attempting the problem. Most skipped it. A few scrawled guesses. 1 or 2 started long division sequences that quickly became tangled. But Kendra sat motionless. Her eyes were not on the board, but in her mind she had already redrawn it. She visualized the numbers like gears, each turning at different rates, each sinking in intervals. She remembered something from a YouTube documentary she'd once watched while Monique slept on the couch. Chinese remainder theorem. A term she didn't fully grasp, but one that whispered to her now. The solution would be just above the least common multiple of 3, 4, and 5, which was 60. So 61, that was the answer. But she didn't write it down. Not yet. Mr. Dalton rose and began walking the aisles, peeking over shoulders. He nodded at guesses, offered small encouragements, but his eyes kept drifting back to the girl near the window who hadn't touched her pencil. It wasn't because she was stuck. It was because she was waiting. He approached her desk. Not feeling it today, he asked quietly. Kendra looked up, locking eyes with him for the first time. And in that look, he saw it. Not confusion, but restraint. Not fear, but calculation. I know it, she said softly. But I think it's a trick. Mr. Dalton raised an eyebrow. Why? It's not the answer that matters, she replied. It's who you think will try. He felt something lodge in his throat. Is it 61, she added. He gave no response. She smiled just faintly and looked back at her blank page. This wasn't just about solving a problem. This was about being seen. And she knew, maybe better than anyone, that most of the adults in her life had never really looked. Until now. But Mr. Dalton wasn't ready to show his hand. Not yet. He needed more than instinct. He needed irrefutable proof. Because challenging the system, really challenging it, meant stepping into fire. And he wasn't naive. He knew how districts protected themselves, how even well-meaning teachers got steamrolled. The moment you questioned the rubric, you questioned the institution. Still, something in him hardened. He would not let her slip through. That afternoon, he sent a private message to the district's gifted coordinator, requesting temporary access to the archived cognitive screener tool from the discontinued pilot program. He cited assessment review purposes, and said nothing more. Then he uploaded Kendra's logic quiz from the day before. He titled it, Unassisted Pattern Inversion. Student Work Sample A. He didn't sign his name. He wanted the work to speak for itself. That night, while preparing for bed, Monique Holloway stood in the hallway folding towels when she noticed a strange sound from Kendra's room. Quiet humming. She opened the door gently and saw her daughter sitting cross-legged on the floor, building shapes out of rubber bands and graph paper. What are you working on, baby? She asked softly. Kendra looked up. It's a rhythm puzzle, she replied, but I think it's broken. Monique smiled weakly. So you're fixing it? Kendra nodded. Someone has to. Monique blinked back sudden tears. Not because her daughter was smart, but because no one at school had ever asked her to show it. The next morning, Mr. Dalton returned to his inbox to find a flagged reply from the district's gifted office. The subject line read, Urgent Review of Student Work Sample A. Immediate meeting request. The morning unfolded like any other. Lockers slammed, sneakers squeaked across waxed floors, and the walls of Willow Ridge Elementary held their breath beneath another cloudy Indiana sky. But in room 207, time was about to stop. Mr. Dalton arrived early. Earlier than usual. His steps were quicker, more deliberate. The file tucked under his arm, containing a copy of Kendra's printed quiz, the 99.8th percentile test result, and now an email flagged urgent by the district's gifted coordinator. A reply he hadn't expected. At least not this soon. The email was short but powerful. Reviewed. Exceptionally advanced abstraction detected. Arrange in-person observation immediately. Do not disclose to family until validation complete. He knew what it meant. They were curious but cautious. They weren't celebrating the discovery of a genius. They were preparing to control it. By 9:05 a.m., the students filed into room 207. The chatter was loud and chaotic, a usual Thursday buzz, but Kendra walked in quieter than normal, clutching her notebook, her eyes flickering briefly toward the board. And there it was, the same box from yesterday. Mr. Dalton hadn't erased it. In fact, he'd expanded it. A second problem had been added. Bolder, trickier. Dressed up as multiplication but embedded with a logical inconsistency designed to expose gaps in reasoning. The room fell quiet as students read it. If a train travels at 60 miles per hour and leaves Station A at 8:15 a.m., how long will it take to catch up to a train traveling at 45 miles per hour that left Station B 20 miles ahead at 8? Some immediately grabbed pencils. Some groaned. One kid muttered, "Man, I hate these." But Kendra sat perfectly still, her eyes locked onto the board, and for exactly 3 seconds, she didn't move. Not her hands, not her lips, just her eyes, scanning, calculating. Then she slowly raised her hand. Every neck turned. Mr. Dalton blinked. "Yes, Kendra, it's a trick," she said flatly. "The train from Station A never catches up." He tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because you didn't say what direction they're traveling. You assumed it. But if the slower train's heading west and the faster one east, they never intersect. You left out the vector." The classroom went silent. Dead silent. Kendra hadn't just solved the problem. She had dissected its flaw. Mr. Dalton stood still, stunned, but only for a moment. From the back row, a voice whispered, "Did she just say vector?" Then a ripple of noise, and then came the phones. One student lifted their iPad and began recording. Another held up a phone, zooming in on Kendra's face. A few kids laughed, not maliciously, but nervously, because the moment felt too strange, too out of order. This was the girl no one noticed. The one teachers tiptoed around. The one even students avoided out of unspoken consensus. And now she had just outsmarted a question they didn't even understand. Mr. Dalton moved quickly, clapping once. "All right, that's enough. Put the devices away. Back to your seats." But the damage, or maybe the miracle, was already done. One of the videos had already been sent to a friend in another class. That friend posted it on Snapchat. Within minutes it was screen recorded and shared on TikTok with the caption, "Shy girl drops math bomb in 3 seconds." Within an hour, it had 10,000 views. By the end of the day, the comments flooded in. "Who is she? Y'all sleeping on quiet black girls for real? Vector? Bro, I'm in 9th grade and I don't know what that means. Give her a scholarship already. She's a whole genius. And they had her in regular math?" The principal's office phone rang by third period. By lunchtime, Mr. Dalton was summoned for a discussion with the assistant principal, who had barely seen the video but already felt its implications. "We don't condone unsanctioned recordings," she said sharply. "This could become a legal issue." "She didn't film anything," Mr. Dalton replied. "But she was the subject. That makes it complicated." He said nothing, because what he really wanted to say was, "What makes this complicated is that you buried her." Meanwhile, Kendra sat in the cafeteria beside no one, her lunch untouched, her tray empty. A few students whispered nearby. One girl stared too long. Another boy whispered to his friend, and laughed. But Kendra kept her gaze steady, unmoved. If she had learned anything, it was this. Silence could be used to protect. But now, suddenly, her silence had become loud, viral, interpreted. And interpretation was always dangerous. That evening, Monique came home from her shift late, exhausted, her back aching from 12 hours on her feet. She dropped her keys into the bowl, kicked off her shoes, and turned on her phone. 3 missed calls from unknown numbers. One voicemail from a woman at the district office requesting a brief conversation about recent media attention involving your daughter. Monique's chest tightened. She walked down the hallway and peeked into Kendra's room. The girl was awake, sitting on her bed, staring at her iPad, not watching cartoons, not playing games, watching the video. Her own voice, on loop. "You left out the vector." Monique sat beside her. "Kendra, what is this?" Kendra didn't answer. She simply clicked replay, and the world watched her again. Again. That night, the video made it to Twitter, retweeted by a nationally recognized STEM educator, with the caption, "This child just exposed every flaw in our public gifted programs." The next morning, news vans waited outside Willow Ridge Elementary. The following morning, Kendra Holloway became the most talked about student in Brookridge, and possibly the entire state of Indiana. Not because she won a competition, not because she was given a medal, but because someone had finally watched her long enough to realize she was extraordinary. By 8 a.m., her video had crossed 1 million views. By 9 a.m., Willow Ridge Elementary's front lawn had become a circus. News vans lined the curb, reporters angled their tripods toward the school entrance, and security guards blocked the main hallway from curious camera lenses. Principal Hargrove's face was the color of damp paper, his voice cracking as he instructed the office secretary to shut down all external interviews and redirect all media inquiries to the district office. Inside room 207, Mr. Dalton arrived to find the tension coiled tight. The students had already seen it. The video, the comments, the duets on TikTok. Some were amused, some confused, but a few weren't amused at all. Especially not Kyle Sherman, the self-appointed class math champion. She got lucky, he muttered loudly, loud enough for half the class to hear. Bet she saw the answer online. No one corrected him, but a few nodded. Because fame didn't feel like celebration. It felt like exposure. Every glance now lingered. Every whisper now landed. And the words that weren't said out loud echoed louder than the ones that were. At recess, a group of students huddled near the basketball court, throwing glances in her direction. "She's like a robot," one girl whispered. "Did you see how she didn't even smile when it went viral? She probably doesn't even know what TikTok is." Another sneer. "Her mom probably doesn't let her have anything. She's weird. Weird smart. Weird black smart." That last one lingered. It wasn't loud. It wasn't said with venom. It was just a casual observation. And that's what made it dangerous. Because for students who had never seen a black girl in their class outpace them, not just by a little, but by light years, there was no framework, no category for it. The system had taught them to see black students through one lens. Kendra shattered that lens, and broken lenses cut deep. Later that day during science, a student passed Kendra a folded note. She opened it carefully. "Prove it again or shut up." No name, no signature. She didn't flinch. Mr. Dalton noticed her pause, saw her expression shift, but he didn't press yet. He was already preparing his own confrontation with the system. In the teacher's lounge, murmurs pulsed like static. "She's a prodigy," someone said. "She's being exploited," someone else replied. "Her mother should have told us she was different." "Is she? Or is this just a fluke?" Then Miss Whitmore chimed in. "I think we need to verify how she's learning this stuff. I mean, it's very advanced, almost suspicious." "Suspicious?" Dalton echoed from across the room, his voice low. Whitmore raised her eyebrows. "We've had kids cheat before, especially on video. They memorize answers and pretend they solved it." Dalton stared at her. "You think an 11-year-old fabricated a multivariable logic pattern just to impress a class that ignored her all year?" "I'm saying we don't know what we're looking at," she replied. "That's because we were never taught to look." The room went quiet. Willow Ridge Elementary supports all its students. We are proud of Kendra Holloway, and will be reviewing our academic placement process to ensure every child has the opportunity to thrive. But that wasn't what got everyone talking. It was the parent complaint, an email, sent anonymously but quickly circulated through internal staff, that landed with a thud. "I'm concerned about the viral video involving Kendra Holloway. No student in regular math should be solving advanced logic in 3 seconds. I'm requesting an official investigation into potential cheating or outside coaching. This situation feels manipulated. No kid like that is that smart. No kid like that." The phrase seared. By the time Monique was called in for a casual conversation, the email had already been printed and placed in a confidential folder, one Monique would never be allowed to see. She sat across from Principal Hargrove and Miss Laurel, the counselor, both offering the same strained smile. "We just wanted to touch base," Laurel began, "about how Kendra is doing with all this attention." "She's quiet," Monique said flatly. "But she's fine. Has she received any tutoring outside of school?" Hargrove asked casually. Monique's brow furrowed. "No." "Why?" "Unusual," Monique repeated, her voice sharpening. "You mean unbelievable?" "No," Laurel said quickly. "Not at all. Just worth documenting." Monique stood slowly, her chair scraping against the tile. If she were a blonde girl named Madison, with a high ponytail and a pink backpack, y'all would be calling her gifted and planning an assembly in her honor. But because she's quiet, and black and smarter than anyone you've ever expected to walk through these halls, now she's suspicious. Neither Laurel nor Hargrove spoke. Monique didn't wait for a response. She walked out of the office, with her jaw set tight and Kendra waiting for her just down the hall. The girl didn't ask what happened. Her mother didn't explain. They both knew. Because going viral hadn't changed the structure. It just turned a spotlight on the cracks. And when the light hits a fracture, it doesn't heal it, it exposes it. That evening, Monique received a certified letter from the school board. The subject: request for formal review of academic integrity. Student, Kendra Holloway. The letter arrived in a manila envelope, stamped confidential in red block ink. Monique Holloway stared at it for several long seconds before tearing the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was a 3-paragraph notice from the Willow Ridge School Board. Subject: request for formal review of academic integrity. Student Kendra Holloway. The language was soft, almost polite. Unusual academic performance. Unverified aptitude spike. Potential outside influence or unapproved assistance. But between the lines, the message was razor sharp. We don't believe your daughter could have done this on her own. By the time Monique finished reading, the skin under her nails burned. She knew what this was. Not an investigation. Not a concern for truth. It was retaliation. The soft, bureaucratic kind, dressed in forms and policy language, sanitized enough to shield itself from claims of bias, but cutting all the same. The next morning, Kendra was pulled from math class by Ms. Laurel and led to a small conference room near the counselor's office. It was cold, fluorescent. 2 chairs, 1 adult, 1 clipboard, 1 mirror, 2-way of course. The woman waiting there introduced herself as Ms. Greaves, an educational compliance officer from the district. Hi Kendra, she said in a sing-song voice, like someone speaking to a toddler. I just want to ask you a few questions about your schoolwork. Nothing scary. Let's start simple, Greaves said. How did you learn to solve logic puzzles like the one in the video? Kendra blinked. I watched them. Watched them. Where? YouTube. Sometimes on my mom's phone. Sometimes on the TV when she's sleeping. Greaves wrote something down. And when did you first start doing these types of problems? I don't know. Was anyone helping you? No. No tutors? No advanced classes outside of school? Kendra shook her head. Greaves smiled. Falsely. Okay, let's try one right now. She handed Kendra a worksheet from her clipboard. Kendra scanned it. A familiar format. Nested logic. A false assumption in line 2. She circled the contradiction, then drew a simplified chart. Greaves watched, eyes narrowing. You didn't even pause, she said, half smiling, half threatened. Kendra didn't respond, because the question wasn't curiosity, it was disbelief, the kind that made you feel like a suspect for being excellent. The session lasted 22 minutes. By the time it ended, Kendra had been made to explain her methods, defend her answers, and repeat several of them out loud, like a spelling bee with suspicion sewn into every syllable. Later that day, Monique received a call from the school board office. We're just gathering more context before moving forward with any changes to Kendra's academic placement, the administrator said, her tone clipped. You're interrogating an 11-year-old without her parent present. We followed protocol. No, you followed fear. That evening, Miss Dalton called Monique. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't apologize. He simply said, I need 10 minutes. I need you to listen. She agreed. He drove across town, stepped into her living room, and placed a folder on her coffee table. Inside were 3 documents. Kendra's 2nd grade spatial reasoning score, 99.8 percentile. Her logic quiz with annotations showing concept levels beyond 8th grade. An unofficial cognitive test he had administered under observation, completed in half the time of the district's gifted benchmark. Monique flipped through the pages slowly. She's top 0.01%, Dalton said. I've seen maybe 2 kids like her in 20 years. Monique looked up. Then why are they treating her like she's a problem? Dalton's jaw tensed. Because her existence challenges their framework. It embarrasses them. They made a mistake, and they can't admit they missed it for years. Monique pressed her lips together, then whispered. Because she's black. Dalton didn't deny it, didn't dodge it. He just nodded. She doesn't even want attention, she whispered. She just wants to be left alone. They won't leave her alone now, Dalton said. Not until they control the narrative. What do? We fight it. She paused. Then we go all in. The next day, Dalton requested a formal meeting with Principal Hargrove. Not through email. In person. In the office. No loopholes. No deferrals. Hargrove sat behind his desk. Expression tight. Voice controlled. Mr. Dalton, I'm not sure what outcome you are expecting here. I'm not expecting. I'm submitting, Dalton said, placing the folder on his desk. This is Kendra Holloway's cognitive data. It aligns with gifted profiles at the national level, not just local, national. Hargrove flipped through it slowly. This data is impressive, he said carefully. But the integrity of that TikTok video still needs to be reviewed. There are concerns about how the problem was introduced. It was introduced by me, Dalton interrupted. I wrote it. I placed it on the board. I watched her solve it. Still, the optics. Dalton leaned forward. She's not a headline. She's not a threat. She's a child who outperformed your expectations. And instead of celebrating her, the school is investigating her like she committed a crime. Hargrove's jaw tightened. Dalton didn't flinch.
Make the call, he said. Move her file to gifted review. Remove the learning disability note. Apologize to her mother. Do it now, or this becomes a bigger conversation. Hargrove hesitated. The silence felt like glass waiting to shatter. And then, unexpectedly, he nodded. I'll initiate the gifted referral, he said. But he added, the district still has to verify. Dalton stood. Then let them try. They'll come up against her mind, and they won't be ready. 2 days later, the district's lead psychologist arrives unannounced, with a battery of high-level IQ tests. But it's not Kendra they ask to leave class. It's her mother. The testing room smelled like fresh toner and old carpet, sterile, soundproofed and painfully quiet. Kendra sat at the lone desk, her back straight, eyes forward. In front of her lay a fresh set of IQ assessment booklets, part of a district-authorized battery of tests that weren't normally administered to children until middle school. Yet here she was, a fifth grader facing what they called the threshold series, a combination of advanced reasoning, pattern analysis, short-term memory, and visual logic. The district was no longer curious. They were now on edge, because the moment Kendra's test video crossed state lines, it wasn't just a viral clip anymore. It became a liability, a reflection, a mirror, showing everyone what the system had failed to see. As the test began, Dr. Hartley watched carefully, timing every reaction, logging every answer. Kendra didn't fidget. She didn't pause for more than 5 seconds on any item. She worked as if the solutions already existed in her mind, and the test was just an exercise in retrieval. She paused after booklet 4. Do you need a break, Kendra? She asked gently. No, Kendra replied softly. Hartley nodded and continued. And when she did, her stomach dropped. Composite IQ, processing speed, 99.9th percentile. Spatial intelligence, off the charts. Verbal reasoning, advanced graduate level. Fluid reasoning, 99.7th percentile. It was not a fluke. It was a case study. Kendra Holloway was not just gifted. She had outscored every student in the district going back 8 years. But then came the second discovery. And someone had chosen not to act. 3 senior board members attended. One flipped through the results, growing paler by the second. This will open a floodgate, he murmured. Good, Hartley replied. No, another interrupted. Not good. This reflects systemic negligence. If it gets out, we're talking lawsuits, accreditation reviews, media backlash. She's a child. Hartley snapped. She deserves to be seen, not managed. The oldest board member, a man who'd been in education policy for 30 years, leaned forward and said calmly, this never leaves this room. We need to handle this delicately. Hartley stiffened. You want to suppress her results? We want to verify them first, through our own channels. You mean stall? The man looked her in the eye. Let me be clear. If this gets out without board authorization, anyone involved in the leak will face termination. That includes you. Hartley said nothing, because she understood the game now. This wasn't about Kendra anymore. It was about power, visibility, and damage control. That afternoon, while Willow Ridge prepared for its annual Student Progress Showcase, the district quietly pulled Kendra's updated test results from the public portal. They marked the file under review. Mr. Dalton noticed the change. He logged in, searched Kendra's name, and found nothing. The data had been scrubbed. He went straight to Principal Hargrove's office, report folder in hand. Where is it? He demanded. Hargrove looked up from his desk. Where's what? You didn't hear it from me. The file loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, as if resisting its own exposure.
Holloway redacted.tbe appeared at the top. Inside, page after page detailed her daughter's cognitive testing, evaluation summaries, percentile scores, and buried standardized data. Each number was more impossible than the last. A 49 IQ, 99.9th percentile in problem solving, a flagged gifted recommendation, dated nearly 3 years ago. Monique's chest tightened.
They knew.
They had known. The system hadn't missed Kendra's brilliance by accident. It had been filed, processed, and then quietly ignored. Because when the brilliance came in the form of a soft-spoken black girl, with no behavioral issues to flag her as exceptional, it was easier to dismiss than to confront the flaws in the very system meant to nurture minds like hers. Monique sat in the dark for over an hour, the screen glowing in her lap. Then she got up and started printing. The next morning, she walked into the district office, not as a nurse, not as a tired single mom, but as a woman who had reached her breaking point. She asked to speak to the superintendent. They told her he wasn't available. She didn't flinch. "I'll wait." By noon, she was still there. By 2:30, a small crowd had formed. Other parents, curious staff, a teacher or two who had seen the video. She stood quietly near the entrance with a folder in her hand, her daughter's photo clipped to the front, and a copy of the redacted file tucked behind it. By 3:45 p.m., local press began showing up. They hadn't been called. They'd been watching. The story had already begun to leak, first on Twitter, then through a popular black parenting blog that shared Kendra's clip under the title, "Silent Genius, the black girl your school would rather fail than acknowledge." By 5 p.m., Monique was giving her first on-camera statement, standing on the steps of the Board of Education. "They filed my daughter's genius away," she said into a sea of microphones. They knew what she was capable of, and instead of uplifting her, they labeled her delayed. They told her teachers not to expect much, and when she proved them wrong, they tried to erase the evidence. The crowd grew. Parents clapped. Some cried. Others just stood in silence, remembering their own children's battles with invisibility. The district issued a statement that evening. "We take all academic placements seriously and are conducting an internal audit." But Monique was done with their audits. She launched a petition that night, "Rebuild the Gifted Gate, Equity for All Children." Within 48 hours, it had over 10,000 signatures. She began organizing local meetups, inviting parents whose children had been overlooked, ignored, or mislabeled. Some came with folders, others came with tears. All came with fury. Within a week, a makeshift coalition was formed. The Holloway Initiative, named not for prestige, but because it had become a rallying cry. If they can do this to Kendra, they can do this to yours. Monique spoke at town halls, hosted community Zoom calls, met with state education consultants. Her nursing shifts were now balanced with press interviews and legal consults. She didn't sleep much, but for the first time in years, she felt awake. One Tuesday evening, she spoke at a school board meeting. The chamber was packed, standing room only. Teachers leaned against walls. Parents held signs. Some said, "Let her rise." Others said, "Black minds matter." Monique stood behind the podium with steady breath. "You will not define my daughter by what you failed to see," she said. "You will not bury her truth in red tape and bureaucratic silence. And you will not rewrite this as a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and we are choosing to fight back." The applause was thunderous. Principal Hargrove did not attend. Neither did Ms. Laurel. But Mr. Dalton was there, seated in the last row, his jaw clenched, his eyes unwavering. Afterward, as Monique packed her notes into a worn leather folder, a woman in a gray coat approached her. Short, mid-40s, nervous. She looked over her shoulder before speaking. "I work in the district's data office," she whispered. "I saw what you said." Monique narrowed her eyes. The woman pulled an envelope from her bag. It was thin, unmarked, but stamped in red. "Confidential." "What is it?" Monique asked. The woman hesitated. "It's what they use. Behind the scenes. To sort students. It's not just grades. It's predictive. Based on race, income, and language. You didn't hear it from me." She shoved the envelope into Monique's hands and disappeared into the crowd. Monique stood frozen, the envelope resting like a stone in her grip. Back at home, Kendra was asleep. Finally, the girl had been quieter than usual, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She had been asked to prove herself over and over again, and still, it wasn't enough. Monique sat at the kitchen table, opened the envelope, and pulled out 3 sheets of paper. On the first, a chart labeled Student Potential Model, Internal Use Only. It outlined criteria used for early talent tracking. Under the race category, next to black, was a phrase, high variability, proceed with caution. Monique felt her stomach twist. The second page listed names, students ranked for accelerated placement. Kendra's wasn't on it. The third was an internal memo, dated 6 months ago. Adjusting aptitude thresholds for marginalized groups risks grade inflation. Maintain current model. Emphasize teacher recommendation as primary gatekeeper. In other words, keep the bar where it is, even if it means no one clears it. Even if they do. As Monique stared at the data in disbelief, her phone buzzed. A new email arrived from a national investigative journalist. The subject line, "We're ready to tell her story." The hum of the refrigerator filled the Holloway kitchen, as Monique sat in silence, her laptop glowing in front of her and the envelope's contents spread across the table. She had read the documents twice. Now she was on her third pass, each time slower, angrier, more focused. It wasn't just negligence, it was intentional design. The district hadn't merely failed to see her daughter. They had programmed themselves not to. The AI software, branded innocently as Edumetrics Predictive Model Suite, claimed to evaluate early aptitude and future academic growth potential. But behind the branding and tech jargon, the model relied on historical data, teacher-generated inputs, and demographic filters. It didn't assess students equally, it filtered them before they were ever seen. One line haunted her more than the rest. Black students flagged at 26% lower likelihood for advanced trajectory due to historic underperformance trends. Adjust recommendations accordingly. It didn't say due to ability. It said due to trends. The algorithm wasn't looking for potential. It was looking for patterns. And Kendra had been erased by a pattern. That night, Monique responded to the journalist's email. Her message was short. "We're ready. Come see what they've been hiding." The reply came in minutes. By the next afternoon, Monique was sitting across from journalist Ava Clark, a nationally respected investigative reporter who had made her name exposing racial bias in healthcare algorithms. This time she had turned her eye to education, and what Monique gave her was the story no one wanted to believe. Ava's recorder clicked on. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Tell me what they did to your daughter." Monique laid it all out. The misfiled test scores, the delayed gifted placement, the interrogation, the formal investigation, and finally the data system designed to fail children who looked like hers. Ava listened in silence, only nodding as she took notes. Her face didn't flinch, but Monique could tell this was more than a story to her. It was confirmation. "They've automated racism," Monique said at one point. And Ava replied, softly, "Yeah. And now they call it data-driven." Ava left that night with copies of every document. Within 48 hours, she filed a formal Freedom of Information Act request against the district. At first they resisted, but Ava's team had lawyers, and pressure, and reach. By the end of the week she had everything she needed. Internal emails, model documentation, notes from private meetings where administrators discussed minimizing gifted pipeline inflation from underperforming zip codes. In one, a data scientist warned that adjusting the algorithm would lead to a disproportionate elevation of non-traditional students. The reply? Better to manage expectations than to risk placement integrity. In other words, better to keep them out than admit the system is wrong. Eva worked around the clock. She compiled her findings, reviewed the timeline, and verified every line of code with outside experts. The result? A 4,200-word expose titled, "Bias in the Machine: How One School District Programmed Black Brilliance Out of Its Future." It dropped on a Thursday. By Friday morning, it was everywhere. National outlets picked it up. Civil rights lawyers started asking for interviews. TikTok creators stitched the story into breakdowns. Politicians issued statements. The article opened with Kendra's name, but the story wasn't just hers anymore. It was about the dozens, maybe hundreds of black and brown students flagged as low potential before anyone had ever looked them in the eye. In the district office, the panic was immediate. The superintendent held an emergency press conference. He called the article deeply concerning, promised a full investigation, and placed the gifted program director on administrative leave. But Ava wasn't done. In a follow-up interview on a national podcast, she said, "The district didn't just ignore black excellence, it trained a machine to delete it. The consequences aren't theoretical, they're measurable, and they've cost children their futures. Monique listened to that interview while sitting on her porch, Kendra beside her, sketching on graph paper, as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything, because the silence was finally breaking. Calls came in from advocacy groups. A local NAACP chapter offered legal support. State education officials scheduled a review of the district's gifted placement policies. And still some pushed back. On social media, a small but loud group of commenters labeled the movement a witch hunt. They claimed the algorithm was fair, that data doesn't discriminate, that performance gaps were just unfortunate realities. But Ava had already dismantled that in her article's closing line. When you train a machine on biased history, you don't erase the bias. You reinforce it with math. Back at Willow Ridge, the staff tiptoed. No one spoke Kendra's name in the lounge anymore. But whispers passed about lawsuits, job security, and who might be next. Mrs. Crawford hadn't returned since the article dropped. Neither had Miss Laurel. Kendra still sat in the second-to-last row, still quiet, still folding numbers and patterns in her mind like origami. But for the first time, she wasn't invisible. She was a symbol, a crack in the wall, a reminder that intelligence doesn't have a color, but racism always finds a way to paint over it. That weekend, Mr. Dalton received a call from a private school 2 counties over. They had read the article. They had seen the video. They were offering a full scholarship. But he wasn't ready to leave Willow Ridge yet, because Kendra wasn't the only one the system had failed, and he had work to do. As the movement gathered momentum, a white parent filed a petition titled Protect Academic Integrity, demanding the district restore traditional gifted standards. It gathered 500 signatures in 20. The invitation came in a sealed blue envelope, embossed with gold trim and a crest Monique didn't recognize. Inside, the letterhead read, National Forum for Educational Equity and Reform. The event, televised nationally, would bring together students, educators, and policymakers for a 2-hour live broadcast focused on the future of public education. They wanted Kendra to speak. Not just attend. Speak. A 10-year-old girl, who had once been marked developmentally delayed in the margins of a file, now being asked to stand on a national stage. Monique read the letter twice. Then a third time. Kendra sat at the kitchen table, sketching geometric shapes again, one hand curled around a pencil like always. When Monique cased the letter in front of her, she didn't react right away. She just blinked. They want me to talk? She said finally. Yes, Monique said softly. I don't like talking. I know. I like numbers. I know that too. Kendra went quiet for a long moment, then whispered, What if I mess it up? Monique reached across the table and held her hand. You won't. Because you're not speaking for them. You're speaking for every kid who's been told to stay small. The forum was held in Chicago, in a glass-paneled auditorium framed by velvet curtains and rows of national press. Bright stage lights cast an unnatural warmth across the panelists. Educators from all 50 states sat in the audience, their lanyards swaying, eyes sharp. Kendra was the youngest person on the panel. By far. She wore a simple navy dress and white sneakers. Her hair was pulled into 2 neat braids. She sat beside a professor from Yale, a state superintendent, and an education tech CEO who had tried to shake her hand 3 times before she finally nodded in acknowledgement. The moderator, a woman with an Oprah-like calm, leaned forward when it was Kendra's turn. Miss Holloway, would you be willing to share a few words about your experience in the public school system? The audience leaned in. Cameras zoomed. Kendra stood. She walked to the podium slowly, eyes cast down, until she reached the mic. Then she looked up. Her voice was small at first, but steady. I was told I was slow, she said. I was told I didn't talk enough, that I didn't try hard, that I needed support. She paused. They never asked what I saw, only what I didn't say. The audience shifted. I solved problems they didn't understand. And instead of asking how, they tried to make me smaller. They erased my scores. They ignored my brain. She looked down for a moment, then back up. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to be seen. A single clap broke the silence. Then another. Then the room stood. Full standing ovation. Not for her performance, but for the clarity she gave to something most of them had never named. A school board member from Pennsylvania wiped her eyes. An educator from Alabama whispered, That's it? That's the story. Backstage after the broadcast ended, Kendra sat quietly while Monique hugged her tight. You did it, Monique whispered. Kendra didn't smile, but her eyes were softer, like she'd just released something that had lived inside her for years. They were about to leave when a man in a tailored charcoal suit approached. His badge read A. Morris, civil rights attorney. He offered a small smile. Miss Holloway, he said, nodding to both. That was extraordinary. Monique extended a hand, cautious. What can we do for you? I think it's what I can do for you, he said. I've been following your case since the Ava Clark story dropped. My firm specializes in civil litigation tied to educational discrimination, and we think he paused. We think you have a strong basis for a class action lawsuit, not just on behalf of your daughter, but for every student excluded by that algorithm. Monique blinked. I don't want money, she said quickly. This wasn't about a payout. Morris nodded. I understand, but this is about policy, accountability. They didn't just fail your child. They systemically filtered out brilliance. That has consequences. Kendra looked up. You mean sue them? Morris crouched slightly, eyes level with hers. I mean make sure they never do this to anyone else again. Before Monique could respond, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Ava Clark. Tell Kendra to check the National Gifted Database. Something just changed. The courtroom buzzed with a tense, hushed energy as Monique Holloway and her daughter stepped through the double doors, the sound of reporters murmuring behind them. The civil case Holloway v. Brookridge Unified School District had drawn national attention, not because it was the first of its kind, but because of what it symbolized: a mother's refusal to let silence be mistaken for incompetence, and a system's desperate attempt to preserve its illusion of neutrality. Rows of journalists lined the back. Education reform activists filled the benches. A local news crew set up quietly in the corner. The room was brighter than Monique expected, sterile and hollow, as if the walls themselves were afraid of what might be said. Kendra sat beside her mother, expression unreadable. Her small hands were folded in her lap, resting over the same blue notebook she had carried to every meeting since the exposé. She hadn't opened it once, but refused to leave it behind. It wasn't for writing anymore. It was a shield. At the plaintiff's table sat A. Morris, calm and collected, a portfolio thick with evidence stacked neatly before him. His eyes never left the defense as the district's legal team shuffled into place. 3 attorneys in stiff suits, accompanied by a nervous representative from the school board, and a visibly uncomfortable Principal Hargrove. The judge entered, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, and already tired of the theater. Let's begin, she said simply. Morris rose first, walking slowly to the front. This case is not about one child, he began. It is about a pattern, an institutional reflex to reduce, to reclassify, to discard black brilliance, the moment it doesn't fit the profile of what this system has learned to reward. He paused, letting the words sink in. We will show that this district used an unregulated predictive algorithm to pre-filter academic potential, and that this algorithm, coupled with unchecked educator bias, led to the systemic underplacement of students like Kendra Holloway. We will show this wasn't an oversight, it was a design. The district's lead counsel, Miss Templeton, rose in response, her tone defensive and clipped. What happened to Miss Holloway is unfortunate, she said, but the district acted in accordance with existing policies. No one deliberately excluded her. Any algorithm is a tool subject to human oversight, and in this case there is no evidence that anyone intentionally discriminated against the plaintiff. She gestured toward Principal Hargrove. My client had no knowledge of suppressed test scores. The teachers followed standard gifted referral procedures. Monique clenched her jaw. The first witness was a former data technician, quiet, pale and clearly uneasy. Under Morris's questioning, he confirmed that Kendra's test scores had been buried under a misfiled student ID, but under cross-examination, he claimed it was a clerical error, not a deliberate act. The second witness, however, changed everything. A former district employee, the same woman who had handed Monique the confidential envelope weeks earlier. Her name was now public, Jasmine Liddell, and her testimony pierced through every excuse the defense had tried to build. She spoke softly at first, then louder as she gained courage. I was in the room when they decided to freeze gifted referrals from Title I schools, she said. They said it was temporary, said we were balancing the data, but when I questioned why the algorithm flagged black students lower even when their grades matched others, I was told, the model accounts for home environment. Let it do its job. Murmurs rippled across the courtroom. Templeton objected, but the judge allowed it. Then came the moment no one could unhear. Morris walked toward the projector, and clicked to display a series of leaked internal emails. One in particular silenced the room. "We can't have an influx of gifted cases from underperforming zip codes. It'll dilute the program's standards. Just filter by behavioral compliance if needed." The email was dated 2 years prior, signed by a senior program administrator. Templeton scrambled to object. These emails were not properly authenticated. But the judge raised her hand. "Sit down, Miss Templeton." Kendra didn't blink. Her gaze stayed fixed on the floor, as if she'd already known all along what they were now discovering piece by piece. Monique reached for her hand beneath the table, squeezing gently. Outside the courtroom, headlines were already taking shape. "Bias confirmed. Internal emails reveal gifted filtering by race and zip code. Silenced genius. How Kendra Holloway became the face of educational discrimination." The courtroom went to recess shortly after, but the judge remained behind. "Miss Holloway," she said, nodding toward Monique and Kendra. "Please stay. I'd like a private word. Just the two of you." Morris looked up, surprised. "Your Honor," I said in chambers. The bailiff gestured toward the side door, and Monique stood confused but compliant. Kendra followed, her notebook still clutched tightly in her hands. The door closed behind them. The judge sat at a round table in her chambers, a far cry from the elevated bench in the courtroom. She looked tired, but focused. "I've been on the bench 27 years, she said. "I've seen all kinds of discrimination cases, seen school districts twist themselves into knots, trying to explain away things they don't want to fix." She looked at Kendra. "But I've never seen a child quite like yours." Monique opened her mouth to respond, but the judge held up a hand. "I'm not saying this as a judge. I'm saying it as a woman. And a mother." She paused. "They will settle. They'll offer you money, resources, promises of reform, but none of it changes the truth. They let an algorithm decide your daughter's worth. And when that wasn't enough, they let their silence finish the job." Kendra looked up for the first time, then spoke quietly. "They wanted me to disappear." The judge exhaled. "But you didn't," she said.
"You're still here."
She tapped the table once, and now they have to answer for that. As they stood to leave, the judge slipped a sealed folder into Monique's hand. "Off the record," she said. "What's in there will push this case beyond anything you expected." The verdict came on a Monday morning, under a sky so quiet it almost felt staged. Willow Ridge Elementary remained closed for the day. An emergency teacher in service declared under the guise of instructional recalibration. But everyone knew the real reason. Inside the courthouse, the gallery was filled again. Parents, educators, reporters, community leaders, and children who had followed every twist of the trial, with breathless hope. This wasn't just a legal decision now. It had become a cultural one. How far does a system go to protect its own reflection, even if it means distorting the truth of a child's mind? Monique sat beside Kendra once more. But this time her hands didn't tremble. The sealed folder the judge had given her remained untouched in her bag. Its weight a silent promise of something more. Mr. Dalton was behind them, his arms folded, heart pounding. Eva Clark stood near the back, eyes trained on the bench. And across the aisle the district's attorneys sat with tight jaws and clipped breaths, already preparing for damage control. Then the judge spoke. Her voice was steady, her language deliberate. The courtroom hushed into stillness as she began to read. In the case of Holloway v. Brookridge Unified School District, the court finds substantial and credible evidence of systemic negligence, algorithmic bias, and the unlawful suppression of educational records. Monique gripped Kendra's hand. The judge continued. This court awards compensatory damages to the Holloway family for emotional distress, academic loss, and reputational harm. But this ruling does not stop at restitution. It is a directive. She leaned forward. The district is hereby ordered to implement mandatory retraining for all staff involved in student evaluations, revise its gifted screening procedures to remove algorithm-based filtering without human review, and establish an independent equity audit of all placement data from the last 5 academic years. Gasps echoed. One teacher in the back began to cry silently. But the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, the Edumetrics predictive model suite will be suspended immediately pending a federal review, and the district must issue formal written apologies to every family whose child was previously marked as low potential based on the algorithm. It was more than anyone expected. It was a blueprint for change. The room erupted. But Kendra remained quiet, her hand still wrapped in her mother's. Because it was never about the money. It was about truth. Truth finally dragged into the light, after being buried under paperwork, policy, and polite-sounding prejudice. Outside, cameras surged toward them. Microphones reached. Reporters shouted Kendra's name like she was a celebrity, a symbol, a movement in miniature. But she wasn't a soundbite. She was a girl who had never asked for attention. Monique shielded her as they pushed through the crowd, murmuring, "Let's go home." That night, as the family sat at the kitchen table for dinner, pizza boxes stacked high, laughter just starting to replace anxiety, Monique finally opened the sealed folder. Inside was a copy of an internal audit, one that never made it to public view. It contained district data showing that less than 4% of students flagged as gifted in the last 10 years had been black. Less than 4%. In a district that was 20. A footnote at the bottom read, "Adjustments recommended, but implementation delayed due to political sensitivity." Monique folded the folder shut and placed it beside the toaster. She didn't cry, not anymore. She had passed the point where tears could carry the weight of what they had lived through. 3 days later, an envelope arrived in the mail, cream-colored, embossed. Inside was a single sheet of thick, elegant paper. "Dear Ms. Holloway, on behalf of Harvard University's Youth Policy and Innovation think tank, we are honored to invite you to join our 2026 cohort. Your voice has sparked a national conversation. Your perspective belongs in the room. Full scholarship enclosed." Kendra held the letter in her hand for a long time, then said softly, "Do I have to talk?" Monique smiled through her shock. "Only if you want to." Kendra looked down at the letter again. She didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth curled upward, just slightly. Across the country, the story reverberated. Districts reviewed their testing procedures. Lawmakers introduced legislation around algorithmic accountability in public education. And slowly, teachers began to ask different questions, not just who was raising their hands, but who wasn't, and why. The movement had done something rare. It redefined what smart looked like. Smart no longer meant loudest, or fastest, or most compliant. It could look like stillness. It could speak only when necessary. It could be wrapped in quiet black skin, sitting in the back row, dismissed by those too blind to look deeper. And for the first time, schools had to reckon with that. The next morning, Monique opened her email to find a new message, this time from the Department of Education. The subject line, "We'd like Kendra to help us redesign the National Gifted Assessment Model. From slow to Speaker of the Year." Word count 1. 2 years later, the ballroom at the National Education Policy Summit shimmered with soft golden light. Rows of round tables, dressed in white linen and flickering candles, filled the space. Lanyards with state emblems swung from every attendee's neck. It was the kind of room where decisions were made quietly, behind panels and keynote speeches that usually recycled the same talking points. But tonight would be different. A hush fell across the room as the event moderator returned to the stage, her voice smooth and certain. "Tonight we close our summit with a story that challenged us. A student whose voice, though once overlooked, now echoes across our nation's classrooms. Please welcome our 2028 youth keynote speaker, Kendra Holloway." There was a pause, then applause. Strong, sustained, not polite, reverent. At a side entrance, Kendra emerged. Now 12, she walked with deliberate grace, no longer shrinking herself beneath fluorescent lights or behind half-folded notebooks. Her hair, natural and full, framed her face with quiet pride. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a soft gray dress, a nod to her style of simple elegance. At the far end of the room, 2 former teachers from Willow Ridge sat near the back. Mrs. Crawford, older now, and more subdued, stared at the stage with wide eyes. Next to her, Ms. Whitmore folded her hands tightly in her lap, her lips thin, her jaw locked. They had come to support education reform. They hadn't expected to see their former student standing behind the microphone. Kendra reached the podium and adjusted the mic herself. No one helped her now. She looked out over the crowd, and she waited. A full 10 seconds of silence passed.
Not out of nervousness.
Out of intent.
Then she spoke.
"My name is Kendra Holloway," she began. "When I was 9, I was told I needed intervention, that I was slow, that I lacked verbal engagement. I wasn't asked what I could do. I was told what I could." The room stayed frozen. "I never failed a test. I just didn't raise my hand fast enough. I didn't shout over others. I didn't perform the way they wanted genius to look." She paused, scanning the room. Her gaze locked, for the briefest second, on her former teachers. They looked down. She continued. "They wrote me off with rubrics that weren't built for me. algorithms that were trained on the past, forms that didn't account for silence that comes from survival. A few heads nodded. A few more looked away. In fourth grade, I solved problems no one expected me to understand. And instead of wondering why, they asked if I cheated. Now the room was quiet in a different way. Guilt. Recognition. Grief. I'm not here to retell pain. I'm here to issue a challenge. She lifted her chin slightly. Start measuring curiosity. Start observing what you don't understand before you dismiss it. And start listening to the kids who say less. Because sometimes we're the ones thinking the most. Applause started slow.
Then Bill.
By the time Kendra stepped away from the podium, the room was on its feet. Not just for her voice, but for what she had made impossible to ignore. Backstage, she stood alone for a moment. No cameras, no crowds, just her in the silence that used to isolate her, but now protected her. Miss Dalton appeared at her side. He had traveled to DC just to watch this moment. You did it, he said. Kendra didn't smile. She never smiled for show, but her eyes shone. I was never trying to, he chuckled. That's what made it work. Monique stood nearby, proud but quiet, knowing her daughter needed space in this moment. Not a hug, not a flashbulb, just the freedom to stand unshrinked. Before the crowd exited, Kendra was called back to the stage for one final photo, a group shot with other young reformers. As the photographer adjusted the lighting, he asked if anyone wanted to say a closing line. Kendra stepped forward and delivered the sentence that would become her legacy. You never measured my silence. You feared it. The camera clicked. The image would be printed in textbooks, displayed in classrooms, and used in teacher training slides for years to come. Not because it was perfect, but because it told the truth. The truth about a system that mistook silence for lack and genius for disruption. And about a girl who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She just needed them to listen. If you've ever been overlooked, misjudged, or told you weren't enough, just because of where you're from or what you look like, then you know Kendra's story isn't rare. It's repeated in classrooms, offices, and courtrooms every day. Type yes if you believe brilliance should never be silenced. Subscribe if this broke your heart and opened your eyes.